This video is brought to you by patreon.com/modernmouse. More on that later. Pixar's theatrical run is basically 3 decades old, and like their parent company Disney, they have found their history split into eras that represent the types of stories being told, behind the scenes role changes, business strategy changes, and more.
Yeah, soon after I became CEO of the company, I had this crazy idea to buy Pixar.
And while the Disney animation eras have become adopted by the general public, Pixar's eras are something very few people talk about. But acknowledging these eras is key to understanding their history and potentially predicting where they go next. That all said, my name's Josh Taylor, this is Modern Mouse, and today we're talking about Pixar's film eras, how they got their names, and some of the history behind each one of these eras. Back in 2018, I created, at least to my knowledge, the first ever Pixar eras video, and I ended up dividing the company into 4 distinct eras, but a lot has changed in the last few years. A pandemic, the launch of Disney Plus, and just a general cultural shift more towards streaming, Disney's CEO Bob Iger retiring, Bob Chapek taking over, then getting kicked out, and then Bob Iger coming back. Listen, there is a ton to get into, but before we get into the first era with the first films, I think it's good to know some basic Pixar history, especially before their first film, which was Toy Story. Going back to the 1970s, Pixar was a small part of a larger brand called Computer Graphics Lab. They would break away into their own company in 1986 with Ed Catmull and Steve Jobs leading the team. Catmull as president and Jobs investing $5 million into the company. Still known as a personal computer company at that time, Pixar hired ex-Disney animator John Lasseter to create computer animation demos as a way to showcase the ability of the Pixar machines. Lasseter worked alone to create Pixar's first ever short, Luxo Jr., the show at SIGGRAPH, which is the largest computer graphics convention in the world. And soon Lasseter would have an animation team of his own at Pixar, creating animated graphics for things like commercials. And by the end of the 1980s, Pixar opted to move further into computer animation with the intention of creating 3D computer-generated films. Steve Jobs would pitch in an additional $45 million, and a deal with Disney was struck to create and distribute their first 3 animated movies. After years of developing software, building out an animation team, and tireless hours creating basically an entire new style of film, Pixar released their first movie in 1995, Toy Story, bringing us into the first major era of the 4, Pixar's Golden Age. Spanning from 1995 to 2004, Pixar's Golden Era, much like Disney's Golden Era, celebrates artistry and pushing the boundaries of animation. This era features the films Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles. Thanks to Lasseter's background with Disney and his time studying at the California Institute of Art, he understood what made Disney's early animated films so special. The 6 films in the Golden Era showcase a new technology while also focusing on quality characters and storytelling.
It is the blueprint of a piece of equipment designed to make cartoons more realistic and enjoyable.
Similar to how Disney used the multi-plane camera, sound design, and Technicolor to separate themselves from the other animation studios, Pixar was pushing the boundaries with 3D modeling and how much imagery computers could render. If you were around during the 1990s computer boom, then you probably remember how long it took your computer at home to load a single image. Sometimes it felt like an eternity. Seriously, thanks AOL. The release of Toy Story in 1995 felt the same as the release of Disney's Snow White in 1937. A landmark moment in filmmaking that would quickly change how animated films were created and what audiences craved to see on the screen. Woody, Buzz, and the rest of Andy's toys became instantly iconic, with merchandise flying off the shelves. And had Toy Story not been a popular release, who knows where we'd be. We certainly wouldn't be where we are today with dozens of 3D modeled computer animated films releasing every year. Traditional hand-drawn animation quickly became old hat, and by the beginning of the 2000s, computer animation was making more money than any traditional 2D animated film. Each film following Toy Story pushed the technology even further. A Bug's Life added more characters, Monsters, Inc. added textures like fur, Toy Story 2 forced the team to go back to their original characters and settings with even more detail, Finding Nemo took us underwater, and The Incredibles showed us how human figures had advanced past the plastic look of Andy in Toy Story, while also showing us water and fire elements as well as so much more. It seemed like each new film featured a behind-the-scenes story about innovating and advancing the style of animation that Pixar had pioneered. Of course, that would still continue at Pixar, but it seemed like it was part of the marketing campaign during this era, and an important role in the story of Pixar for its fans. All the films of this era were made solely by Pixar, with Disney only bringing in minor notes and a distribution deal. Think of it as a cooperative and competitive kind of relationship. It really allowed Pixar to have its own identity. And of the important figures in this era, the first 3 films were directed by John Lasseter, but the last 3 are directed by Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, Lee Unkrich, and Brad Bird. Those 5 men would go on to define not only this era, but also the next one, the Merger Era. A short era spanning from 2006 to 2010, and consisting of the movies Cars, Ratatouille, WALL-E, Up, and Toy Story 3. During the early 2000s, Michael Eisner,
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner,
still head of the Disney company at that time, opted to end ties with Pixar when the company asked for a higher share of revenue and ownership over their films. Because of legalities, Disney was able to keep control of the characters and the films that Pixar had made up to that point, and Eisner created a new division under Disney for those characters called Circle 7 Animation. There were plans drawn up for 3 films, Toy Story 3, Finding Nemo 2, and Monsters, Inc. 2 Lost in Scaradise. Within a year, Eisner was out of Disney, and Bob Iger was named the new CEO of the company, where he struck up a deal with Pixar to just buy them outright. All of Circle 7's productions were completely canceled, and Pixar's first film of the era, Cars, became the first co-branded Pixar and Disney film. Despite the buyout from Disney, Pixar still continued to operate separately, with their Northern California animation building still going strong today. But executive changes would actually end up changing the dynamics between Pixar and Disney. John Lasseter would not only continue to run Pixar, but also became the chief creative officer for Disney, where he would run Disney Animation and contribute ideas to Disney's theme parks and other ventures. Along with Lasseter, Ed Catmull would take over as both president of Pixar and Disney Animation. And the films of this merger era continue to tell imaginative stories, similar to the previous era, because a lot of the animation team, including those main directors, stuck around. Outside of Toy Story 3, this is also an era of original storytelling, and you could make an argument that Toy Story 3 is the best sequel film that Pixar has ever made. The films of this era also have a maturity and confidence to them, something that comes from the storytellers at Pixar having more than a decade of work under their belt. They feature stories about environmentalism, growing old, losing loved ones, slowing down, and seeing the world from different points of view. The animation also continued to evolve and get better. A focus on realism in WALL-E, for example, allowed the studio to create a beautiful outer space, decaying planet Earth, and a sleek look to the design of the robots and Axiom spaceship. Revisiting the world of Toy Story for a third time also showed the growth that Pixar had in terms of its abilities to create textures, colors, shading, and more. Pixar animation during this period became a true standard for animation studios. By the mid-2000s, competing companies like DreamWorks Animation had moved from traditional hand-drawn animation to CGI, with smaller companies following suit. Even Disney, thanks to Lasseter and Catmull's involvement, moved away from hand-drawn animation completely during this era, making way for Disney's revival. Here's where things get a little bit tricky and could be up for debate, because you could make the argument that the first film of this era, Cars, could be the last of the Golden Era, with it being directed by John Lasseter, as well as being the last work of longtime Pixar employee Joe Ranft, who tragically passed away in a car accident. But here at Modern Mouse, the story of Pixar and their relationship with Disney is just a vital part of the company's history and who they were at the time and what they would become in their third era, the Experimental Era. This era ranges from 2011 to 2018 and consists of Cars 2, Brave, Monsters University, Inside Out, The Good Dinosaur, Finding Dory, Cars 3, Coco, The Incredibles 2, and Toy Story 4.
Look, I know this is a little strange, but you gotta trust me on this.
The era is defined by a large amount of sequels and movies that thought outside the box. The Experimentation Era saw a second generation of Pixar storytellers and directors, in an animation style refined little by little with each film, being perfected rather than being pushed into new realms with very few exceptions. This era also saw Pixar's first lackluster ratings and performances at the box office. Cars 2 and The Good Dinosaur are generally seen as major disappointments. Monsters University, Brave, and Cars 3 didn't make the money that Pixar had hoped for. And you could speculate that with Lasseter and Catmull pulling double duty at both Pixar and Disney, the quality in storytelling slipped a bit. But you could also say that new voices coming into their own needed to grow and experiment during this time period. With Disney fully owning the company, it's clear that sequels to popular franchises were needed to keep toys selling and keep the theme parks packed. Despite the popular belief among many that Cars was Pixar's worst franchise, Disneyland opened Cars Land with people flocking in droves. Toy Story Land would open internationally as well as at Disney's Hollywood Studios at Walt Disney World, keeping the franchise alive and well. While the studio was still innovating animation, their concerns were more than just telling stories with stunning visuals. They had to think about merchandising and keeping their franchises relevant. But regardless of all of that, there's still some serious gems in this era. Inside Out and Coco had both critical and box office success. Finding Dory and The Incredibles 2 saw major box office success and would push boundaries further. Unsurprisingly, these four films were stories directed by Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, Lee Unkrich, and Brad Bird, the veteran team at Pixar. That's not to say that these are the only people that can be trusted with directing Pixar films, but it does show that while films under the established team could thrive, there was room for some new blood, and Pixar was willing to let them experiment and grow into better storytellers. The Good Dinosaur may have not been Pixar's greatest film, but it did allow artists to experiment with hyperrealism and cartoonish characters. Even shorts during this time period felt like experiments worth watching. Lava and Piper in particular are two worth noting for their use of music and animation. Speaking of shorts, I'm going to talk about this video's sponsor. Hopefully, it's you. See, I love making videos here talking about film history and film analysis and bringing together a group of people to make fun videos, but currently everybody that works on Modern Mouse videos is just volunteering their time and energy, and I'd love to at least be doing this part-time and being able to pay other people part-time to do this, and that's where Patreon comes in. Because for $5 a month, you'll not only get audio podcasts that feature Joe and I talking about how we made videos or some of the research that we did that maybe didn't fit into a video, but might be cool to talk about on a podcast. And you'll also get bonus videos where I talk about Pixar and Disney shorts. We add several new videos and podcasts to Patreon every month, and if you love what we're doing here on YouTube, I can guarantee that you'll love what we're doing over on Patreon. So if you wouldn't mind just clicking the link down below where it says Patreon and just browsing around for a while. Or if you can't click the link because you're watching on a TV or something, just type in patreon.com/modernmouse. And now, let's get back to talking about the Experimental Era, because something important happened during this era with John Lasseter. By the end of this era, Lasseter had to step down from his role at Disney and Pixar due to allegations from staff, and longtime Pixar employee Pete Docter stepped into the Chief Creative Officer role at Pixar, with Ed Catmull stepping down as well from his presidential role to simply become an advisor. These executive changes completely shook up Pixar and allowed for further growth, giving the new faces at the company bigger opportunities in the next era, the Personal Era. Pixar's Personal Era started in 2020 and is possibly still going. It contains the films Onward, Soul, Luca, Turning Red, Lightyear, and Elemental. A major part of this era is the COVID-19 pandemic and the ever-changing landscape of how films are distributed. So it's unclear how successful this era has been financially, as it may not be the fault of the stories or the storytellers during this era. But there are some other things in this era that make it feel cohesive. Like other eras, you can make an argument for the first film in this era, Onward, to be tied to the previous era instead. But I think its role during the pandemic of being pulled from theaters as they were shutting down and simply given away on Disney Plus plays a major role in how it's remembered. The other important note to Onward is that it's tied heavily to its director Dan Scanlon, who lost his father in a car accident when he was too young to remember him. He would base the film off of his own life story, leading to a slew of other films based on the lives of the directors and writers who were making them. Kemp Powers, Enrico Casarosa, Domi Shi, and Peter Sohn all brought their personal stories to life. Not only had they gone from being the new employees at Pixar to the veterans of the company, but this second generation of Pixar storytellers brought something back to Pixar that had been missing during the previous era: a ton of heart. I'm not saying that the films from the Experimental Era aren't good or don't make people shed tears, but it's clear that the films of the Personal Era touch people in ways that feel personal. Outside of Lightyear, this era is made up of completely original ideas, as well as allowing for some changes to the animation. For years, Pixar's focus was to make 3D modeling and computer animation look real. They achieved that by the time that they got to The Short Piper or the film A Good Dinosaur, so this era is made up of animation that doesn't necessarily move into reality. Turning Red, for example, plays with Japanese and Korean culture and their animation styles, while Elemental plays with adding more hand-drawn animation over the CGI. There are things to criticize though. Pixar, the one-time standard bearer of animation, no longer feels that way. Animation during the 2010s began to diversify and stray away from the Pixar look. Unfortunately for the company, that means that some audiences became tired of seeing Pixar's style and craved for the studio to push animation somewhere different rather than relying on something that is now 3 decades old. What that style is and how they go about it, if they change at all, is up for debate. The Pixar Spark shorts released on Disney Plus have been a good test of what Pixar can do outside of their traditional look, but those styles have yet to be fully implemented into a long-form film from the studio. I alluded to it before, but I'm unclear if we've seen the end of this era. This video is being produced after Elemento, but before Elio. Elemental was a box office success, the only one from this era, which could lead to a new era, but it also could be completely irrelevant information in the future. What I do know is that Pixar is continuing forward with 2 new releases in 2024, including a sequel to Inside Out that does not have Pete Docter as its director. And I'd love to hear from you. What do you think is next for Pixar? What do you think about these eras? What's your favorite film from each era? Or what is your favorite era? And until next time, my friends, thanks for watching. Keep moving forward. Hey, it's Editor Josh here. I'm just finishing up this era's video, and I plan to do a ton more, not just Pixar and Disney, but a bunch of things outside of it. So if you have an idea, leave one in the comment down below, and I'm gonna definitely be doing a lot more of these in the future. So if you signed up for these eras videos, and they've been few and far between. Make sure to check your subscription box because a lot more are coming down the pipeline, I promise.